Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the ISAS-UOS conference titled The City and Environmental History in Colonial and Post-Colonial South Asia. This conference is a collaboration between the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the University of Southampton, UK. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat to the chairperson. The questions we collected for the panelists to answer. We'll commence with the third panel now, titled Climate Change and Cities in South Asia, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. We are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Professor Danish Mustafa, Professor Critical Geography, King's College, London; Ms. Vasita Vijayanarke, International Lawyer and Executive Director, Slyken Trust, Colombo, Sri Lanka; Dr. Misla Mohammed, Executive Director, International Center for Environment Development and Operational Research, the Maldives; and Mr. Mohammad Inaz, Director, Climate Change and Sustainable Development, FGS Consulting Private Limited, the Maldives. Chairing this panel is Dr. Iqbal Singh Savaya, Visiting Research Associate Professor, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Dr. Iqbal, please.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to what's promising to be an excellent panel. So without further ado, let's take this on the road. So Professor Danish Mustafa, could I invite you to start the panel?
Okay, thank you so much for having me over. It's certainly a pleasure to be able to present to us, to be in this very distinguished panel. And hopefully I'll be able to make a case to you regarding contemporary Pakistani urbanism and the kinds of stories that plants tell us about what's happening with urbanism in Pakistan. So I'm just going to share the screen here. Share screen. So there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek in the title. As you can tell, my date palm is bigger than your date palm. And as we go through this particular presentation, hopefully the logic of why I have gone with this particular title might become clearer. I'm going to do, here we go. Okay, so Pakistan is probably one of the fastest urbanizing countries in Asia. They are some of the most remarkable numbers that you see when it comes to actual urbanization. And something very interesting happened in early 2000s, that there's an established thesis that there are ways through infrastructure, through roads, dams, and those sorts of interventions, the state makes the society legible to itself. And seeing like a state is a very sort of a common refrain that is put out there. I would argue that increasingly in the 21st century, the politics have switched towards the visual, and there the issue is not just that to see like a state or to act like a state, but rather to be seen like a state. Because increasingly in the aftermath of the war on terror, the conversation had become about, fragile states, these sorts of spaces where the state is very weak, and somehow it needs to make itself legible to the rest of the world in a sort of a neoliberal register where international capital recognizes a state as a worthy partner along with which it can do business. So the conversation in post-colonial world was about, well, how does a state establish itself within a territory and essentially make the territory legible to itself? I would argue in this post-colonial world, certainly in the 21st century, the conversation has become more about how does the state make itself legible to international capital, to be seen like a state. So if that be the case, there are a couple of quotations that I have put to you. All states these days are very obsessed with the politics of the visual and how they are being perceived by the rest of the world. And this particular quote by General Musharraf, the dictator in Pakistan in the early 2000s, which is about a soft image of Pakistan. If you're talking to anyone in Pakistan, and if they are from the right or if they're from the right of the political spectrum, soft image of Pakistan is like a holy grail, that somehow this country that is perceived as a haven for terrorists or all sorts of violence happening, and the Taliban hanging out, the military doing its own shenanigans. The question is, well, how do we project a soft image of Pakistan? And then the second part is, I was talking to this director of Environment, Capital Development Authority of Islamabad, and he said that there's certainly, since the 2000s, a new visual aesthetic has taken up. In the past, the conversation about urban horticulture, and why is urban horticulture important? Let me put it to you that, in fact, there is research from North America which tells us that almost about 70%, sometimes 70% of the domestic water supply is in fact used for outdoor use, for gardens and maintaining the horticulture. And you think, well, why is that interesting? Well, in a country like Pakistan, that is not very unusual, that in a city like Karachi, where you have like 3 or 4 golf courses, and a golf course takes up enough water to supply basic water needs for 22,000 households. So if you have 4 golf courses just in Karachi, which is a desert city, you automatically see that we're talking about enough water that has been siphoned off for about more than 100,000 households. So how is that horticulture being put to use? Pakistan is probably today the second largest importer of exotic seeds, exotic flower seeds in Asia. It's second only to China. It is far ahead of India. So there is also a global $3 billion industry of this horticultural products from different parts of the world going across international boundaries. And Pakistan is one of the largest consumers of that, which is why it becomes a rather interesting conversation around. So, whereas in the past, the idea was that we would have a rural sort of a vision, increasingly the conversation is around a manicured garden in a sort of an international visual brand. So what are the vegetal politics and privilege in Pakistan? And this matters because these vegetal politics essentially means that in a city like Karachi, about 80% of the households do not have reliable access to potable water. Do not have reliable access to water. Why don't they have reliable access to water? Whereas a few kilometers from them, what you have is manicured lawns, golf courses, exotic plants, and so on. So there are state natures, public horticulture, where you have the Islamabad Capital Development Authority, which is a bureaucratic dominated authority. You also have cantonments. Cantonment is a relic of the British colonial legacy in Pakistan, where you have these non-elected representative municipal bodies, which can get lion's share of water, lion's share of all the resources. So you have the Rawalpindi and Karachi cantonments. We did this research in Rawalpindi, Islamabad, and in Karachi, the 2 major cities. And then I'm also going to talk about HSM College Lahore, which is one of the distinguished Etons of Pakistan, where I think at any given time in the Pakistan's National Assembly, for whatever it's worth, ends up having more than 100 people from HSM. It has about 30 to 40% of parliamentarians in Pakistan are graduates of this particular school. Then there is also this real estate developers and the Dubai aesthetic that I'll talk about a little bit, to where you have the Beria town, the Defense Housing Authority, and then there is the nurseries and the seeds vendors there. And then there is the individual householders, the garden wallas, as I call them, where you have the Sahib and Begum Sahib, again, a bit of a legacy of the colonial past. There's the Mali, which is the gardener, which is also a character that we can talk about. And the nursery wallas, so it's a very big business these days. And then there is the HSM College, the rookery of the state. Now here is a photograph where you will see that practically about 3 continents are represented in this particular photograph. At the bottom, you will see right here is the Kangi palm, it's called. I think it's here's from Southeast Asia. You have banana. Bananas are not indigenous to Pakistan. This is coming from South India or Southeast Asia. You have a Mediterranean Ericaria tree right here. And if you look closely, there's a whole set of trees that you would find. This is a people. I don't know what the English name for it is. But the point is that this visual panorama that is being presented, plants are very much, and exotic plants are very much integral to making that particular frame. And furthermore, one thing that Pakistanis have become extremely impressed by, and particularly real estate developers in urban areas have become very impressed by, is the Dubai aesthetic. Pakistanis just cannot wax lyrical enough about Dubai and how pretty it is and how Pakistan should reinvent itself in the register of Dubai. And what has happened as a consequence, on the right is the photograph from Rawalpindi cantonment, where you can see, because in Pakistan, the cantonments are one of the most well-appointed kinds of places dominated by the military. And military likes order, very much the order. And here you will see that even all of these trees, the palm trees, look like they're on parade because they're wearing these white little socks, and then there's, coloring and everything, and they're all in a straight line. So on the one hand, here's this palm, exotic palms in Rawalpindi in northern Pakistan. It's a Dubai aesthetic because Dubai Dubai is not even original because they are following Los Angeles, to be honest with you, in terms of recreating a certain image of what constitutes a modern urban cityscape. And that gets transplanted in Pakistan. And this tree, unlike an old Bargat tree in old Rawalpindi, where it provides an amenity of shade, it provides amenities, and other sorts of local trees would provide amenities of nutrition, shade, and so on. These trees have to be maintained at incredible expense, particularly expense of water in order to sustain them. But it's something that makes it look pretty. So whereas in the past, urbanism meant multiple kinds of values that would be realized through urban horticulture, nowadays increasingly it is about the visual. This visual part, on the one hand, requires incredible amounts of irrigation and diversion of water towards it. On the other hand, it's also very expensive. Now, this particular tree was about 1 million rupees, which is about let me see, 1 million rupees would be, it's about $20,000. This is at a nursery in Karachi, and this tree is going to be sold. It's an Italian tree, by the way, which is going to be sold in Karachi. But there are actually people who are going to pay $20,000 for a fully mature tree to have it in their gardens. It's going to require a lot of water. It's going to require a lot of energy to maintain it, but it's conspicuous consumption. Take a look at this quote. So the emphasis now on color, on the visual, on making them look neat, visually attractive. And in Patoki, in central Punjab, we have one of the largest horticulture markets in Asia, where a lot of these trees are being supplied. And what Pakistan has done is that it has gone for the North American automobile-dependent urban sprawl kind of a urban growth. And what you find there are 2 or 3 major actors. Pakistani Army is one of the largest real estate developers in the country. And they have the Defense Housing Authority, which is, if you really look at the area and extent of most cities, what you'd find is that about more than 50% of the land, actual aerial extent of the land, is taken up by Defense Housing Authorities. And then there is also the Beria town. Beria translates into Navy. It has got nothing to do with the Navy, but nevertheless, this person is very, very wisely using the name of the Navy to say that there is a defense sort of a wrapping on it to build these other distinguished and high-end housing developments. And these developments are hugely driving the demand for these exotic plants. And with these exotic plants comes a major demand for water. And the fact that these exotic plants are not necessarily suitable for the kind of a landscape or climatic conditions that we have in Pakistan, where in the summers the temperature can go up to 45 degrees Celsius. And when you have an automobile-dependent, wide roads and very little public transport. So in a place like Beria Town or DHA, if there is no public transport and there are these wide roads, in July 2017, 1,300 people died in 2 days from heat stress in Karachi. How did they die? Because there was no shade, because there was no water, and there was all paved area where high temperatures essentially led to massive death, massive number of deaths. Now take a look at this. I really like the modern and wonderful landscaping in UAE, just to further underline my point about how impressed they are looking outwards. And then the whole idea of this liminality of living abroad. And this was one of the signs for another one of these housing developments. Come to this particular town, it's like living abroad. I.e., how can we distance ourselves from this messy, everyday context of Pakistan and retire into this land of unreality or being abroad. Now here you can see plants are a very effective means of marketing real estate. During Ramadan time, many Muslims in Pakistan tend to are feeling quite pious, and perhaps planting date palms gives them the feeling of piety and feeling good factor, and presumably that helps with marketing real estate in this particular context, as per this particular quote. Here's another quote from a plant wholesaler in Patuti, who's saying, ever since Beria Town has been built, our business has been booming. They're our biggest customers. I'd say the housing society is imitating Beria Town. About 60% of our business, the remaining 40% is nurseries. So here's a very interesting Iqbal nursery. Our specialization is in Korean, American, Tiffany, and Australian grass. If anyone has any idea, Korean grass takes up absolutely stupendous amounts of water. And this in a country which cannot supply water to 80% of its urban population. You have a booming business in Korean grass, which is essentially going to be fed by municipal water supply. And what does that matter? This person very nicely, this is Franklin, by the way, my research partner. And he's saying, my grandfather came to Islamabad wearing no shoes. Today, I own many vehicles like that, pointing to his Toyota Land Cruiser outside. It used to be that if you were rich, you would show off by getting drunk and buying hoes. Now they've realized that they can also show off through plants. They don't care about plants. They just want to show off. The story of contemporary urbanism and elite urbanism in Pakistan, which you want to show off on your own account. That's not a problem. But when it comes at the expense of the access to water to others, then definitely we have an issue. And meanwhile, this extremely patriotic homeowner wanted to have a little crescent and a star to show off his patriotic credentials in his garden. And as you will see, that there is not one plant in this photograph which is indigenous to Pakistan. Almost all of them are exotic. Almost all of them are water-intensive kinds of plants that they use. Here's another example of a kind of exotic landscape that this person has built. On the other hand, here's another example in Karachi of a gardener who's decided to start planting plants and to be more water conservationist and trying to talk to the environmentalist register that look here how ecologically responsible we are, and therefore we are. So what are some of the preliminary conclusions that I would share with you? On the one hand, there is all of this conversation about right to the city. What we found out is that plants have in fact become a conduit for excluding the poor from the city. That the right to the city is in fact mediated by horticulture, by plants, by these inanimate, can you say plants are animate or inanimate? I'm not sure. Either way. Shade and nutrition in the past, I remember as a child growing up in urban Pakistan, the cities used to be littered with these plant trees. You'd have people climbing up these trees and taking down, apples or oranges or guavas, or, there'd be all sorts of vegetables being grown everywhere. I remember I was so upset with my mom most of the times because anytime she'd move into a house, she'd immediately, plant some garlic, some tomatoes, some chilies, and all of our salad used to come from our back house. And I always used to think that my parents are so lame because they always grow a vegetable patch Whereas all the cool kids who seem to be more sort of cosmopolitan than my parents, it seemed to me were, they all used to have nice lawns. And my parents would always dig up a lawn and in fact have a vegetable patch over there, which I thought was really uncool. In retrospect, I think that it was so wonderful that they used to do that. And having a lawn, in fact, was the stupid part of it. But either way, the point is that whereas in the past, the plants were supposed to provide these environmental amenities of shade and nutrition, today, the only amenity that's expected of them and the only amenity they in fact end up delivering is the visual aesthetic part of it. And for the Pakistani upper classes, the international visual grammar of these neat, tidy sort of medians that they see in these movies from America and from Europe and what have you. And American landscaping is another sort of a conversation one can have about how urban areas are sort of built up in that context. And that has become a mark of hypermodernity for the Pakistani elites. Pakistani elites want to be seen in that register. Look here, how modern we are. Look at the sort of nice manicured kind of landscaping. And whereas the relationship to the non-human world of plants, I would argue, is increasingly instrumental and commercial. They don't know anything about plants. I mean, there's a relationship that my grandmother used to have with everything that she grew. I mean, there was a symbiotic relationship of love, affection, of knowledge, of companionship that she had with these plants. Today, if you're paying $20,000 for a fully grown Italian, I don't know what fig tree, what kind of a relationship do you have with that tree? How does that work? And not there. The relationship is not there. It's there to just basically show to people, look here, this is what I have. This is how much money I have. And there is almost a catastrophic loss of ecosystem services, and that catastrophic loss manifests itself in terms of heat stress. It manifests itself in terms of malnutrition. Whereas the urban ecology used to provide some of those services, they're not just there anymore. And remarkable part is I was talking to these people, their farmers markets have become a bit of a rage amongst the Pakistani elites. And I said, farmer markets, that's just bizarre. Because right after the 1980s, practically 100% of the food supply in Pakistan was organic. And now after 10 years of, aping the Western part of it, they've gone back to, oh, no, now we want to have organic because it identifies you with this upper class, elite, white consumption of the environmental ethos in the global north. And they want to go with that. And I was like, guys, the reality is in Pakistan, most of the poor people do eat organic because they have to. They can't afford the fertilizers and water. And it's news to them. It's totally news to them. They just think that they have come upon the holy grail by coming up with this whole idea of organic. Whereas, South Asia, well, that's what they did before the Green Revolution happened. Either way. And then there is this whole conversation about scales, about the national scale, production of Pakistan as a soft image, production of Pakistan as a neoliberal entity, production of Pakistan as a space where international capital is welcome for business, is another kind of a conversation that I could definitely have in the question and answer session. I'm not going to elaborate on that too much. But overall, the point is that plants become the conduit for creating Pakistani urbanism. And the way it is being created is having some very adverse consequences for the urban poor in Pakistan.
Thank you for starting us off on such a great start, Danish. And so we'll move on now. And could I invite Ms. Rosita Vijanayake to present the second talk of the day?
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
try to share my screen. So I believe it's good afternoon from where you're joining, most of you. Or good morning or good evening, wherever you're joining from. I'm very pleased and happy to be part of this panel, which is discussing a very interesting topic. The research that I would be presenting focuses on how human environment coexist, human and environment coexist, and how urban development and the Colombo wetland complex relates to this conversation. And the paper is done with Dennis Mombal. I will be presenting on behalf of both of us. So the structure of the presentation, the general outline is related to the objective and the methodology applied in this research, and the background to what Colombo is and what province it's part of and how it relates to climate impacts. And then also a background to what Colombo wetlands are and the ecosystem and biodiversity value related to it. And then also looking into how historic urban expansion and post-colonial patterns of land appropriation and usage applies to the discussion we are focusing on at the moment. Then I will look into how stakeholder mapping mandates and responsibilities would relate to, relate to the discussion on how wetlands contribute to climate resilience, as well as how urban planning integrates with the processes that we're discussing. For example, like SDGs, climate discussions, and also legislative background to things. And then I'll look into recommendations. And also, I'm really sorry if I suddenly disappear. I'm having a bad internet and electricity day, so I'll try to join via phone if that happens in the middle of the presentation. So the key guiding questions that we've looked at include a focus on climate impacts, as well as the connection between Colombo wetlands and human development, and the negative or the positive impacts, the connections to it. And also the impacts of climate change and how these are being addressed. And the methodology relates to doing a literature review around what's available, interviews with experts and key stakeholders, then analysis of historical meteorological data, legal and policy frameworks, as well as validation of research findings through guidance from experts in the focus areas that we have been focusing on. One of the constraints that we faced is the analysis of historical meteorological data due to inability to access some of this data in the lockdown time because metadata needs to be purchased. So this would be enhanced from July 5th because we will have access to data. So there'll be an update looking at a more recent data analysis. Background to Colombo and the Western Province. So Colombo is located in the Western Province of Sri Lanka. For those who are not familiar with Sri Lankan geography, Colombo is the capital, rather the business capital of Sri Lanka. And there are three districts that are part of Western Province. And we have different divisional secretariats and then Gram Nildar divisions, which are part of the Bawan system, administrative system. And then Colombo is the most densely inhabited district of Sri Lanka. So the growth or the investments that come into land purchasing, development of business and commercial enterprises would be higher in Colombo, and the prices allocated to land would be higher than many other areas as well. So the climate impacts, this is based on an analysis done by the Western Province for the adaptation plan. So we see the maximum temperature ranging up to around 32 degrees, and then the rainfall patterns that have been mapped up to 2012. And if I summarize this, the Western Province, of which Colombo is part of, receives annual rainfall of about 1,500 to 4,500 millimeters. And Colombo receives over 3,000 millimeters per year. And this is 70% of it comes from southwest monsoon and second intermonsoon. In the climate data that was presented, the analysis is that the daily minimum temperature increase is significant and it's visible, but there doesn't seem to be a quantitative change in the rainfall that's received. But the research on climate change, recent research, many research, indicate that while the average rainfall has not changed, there is an intensity of rain that is felt. So that would lead to floods and also planning processes that need to address it. So it could be the fact that the infrastructure doesn't facilitate this, the impacts that have been felt on the wetlands that does not facilitate the city to adapt to what's being received as rainfall because there's no evacuation of the water that's received. But it's calculated that the rainfall pattern has changed while the rainfall amount received has not changed. So background to the Colombo Wetlands Complex overview, if I may say so. Colombo is, as I mentioned, the largest city and commercial capital and has approximately 1,900 hectares of wetlands within its administrative boundaries. And there is also a system of canals, lakes, and wetlands, collectively known as Colombo Wetlands Complex. And then this is also around closer to the Parliament of Sri Lanka as well. So this is, if you come to Colombo and you move towards the Parliament of Sri Lanka, this is something very visible. And it's also named as a Ramsar city recently, and there was analysis done as part of this process to identify different elements that were mandating it to be identified as a Ramsar city. And there is, I believe, I think in about a year, there's an evaluation to identify whether the commitments or the activities that were needed to be as part of Ramsar city are being done. And there's a Callan River Basin and estuary that's connected to these systems. And then when we have floods, we always refer to the river that's mentioned here as well. So this is a map of the Colombo Wetlands Complex. So you can quickly have a look at it. And looking at the ecosystem services or the biodiversity value of the area, it includes around 60 species of freshwater fish, and 30 of which are endemic. So there's a higher biodiversity value, and there were some biodiversity assessments that have been done as part of the UN biodiversity reporting, as well as climate change vulnerability mapping. And there's also 280 species of animals, 250 species of plants. So there is a high value of biodiversity in the region that we are focusing on. And 87% of wetland areas in Colombo contribute to food security as well. So if we look at the Western Province Adaptation Plan that was developed in 2015, which feeds into or integrates to national adaptation planning processes in the country, they allocate a high priority for food security as well, while taking into account the ecosystem and biodiversity conservation. And then the Colombo Flood Detention Area historically fulfilled a critical function. So the Colombo, the Colombo Flood Detection Area and the connection to the Colombo Wetlands Complex is important because the Colombo Wetlands Complex historically fulfilled a critical function in preventing floods by absorbing water, slowing runoff into streams. So this is why I mentioned about how the constructions that have been done over the last years have impacted the resilience and also reducing the climate and disaster risks. And it is also due to the fact that wetlands are being decreased, the use of the land and the practices that are being implemented have changed. And at the moment, there are processes where they are decasseting and processes are there to ensure wetlands are mapped and also enhanced. So this is ongoing. They are supposed to advertise recently as well. So if we are looking at the potential for climate action as well as contributing to biodiversity conservation, the wetlands have a high capacity for carbon sequestration and both sequestration and storage, both of those. And also wetlands provides a variety of other ecosystem services such as temperature reduction or regulatory services, buffering the negative impacts of airborne pollution. So it has been evaluated as having a value of close to 3,890 million Sri Lankan rupees. And that if the destruction happens, it's about 19.45 million per hectare, the value that is lost. I'll quickly go through to the colonial times and how it relates to the past times, how it connects. So the Colombo Municipal Council was established in 1865, and with the development of additional British quarters and different ordinances that relate to urban development, there were low-income slums that became seen as a problem or associated with the proximity of the wetlands. And after the enactment of National Urban Housing Development Policy in 1978, and then the conversion of the capital of Sri Lanka, the Sri Lanka Java, the Nupura Court area in Colombo, this was certainly very important because the parliament is in the area and the land reclamation rates were highly increased due to this, which impacted the wetlands that were in this area. So the project proposals of this time had a focus on slum resettlements and the development needs. And then also looking at how the expansion of the city would be overlapping with the wetlands that were then, how to kind of balance out the need for land for expansion with the use of lands that existed. So which ensured that there would be clearing, or there were clearings of wetlands, and then there was unauthorized construction that happens, which was having harmful impacts on the biodiversity and the ecosystems. And then there was also, with the growth of the economy as well as the development plans that came in, there was the real estate value had a high increase between 1990 and 2005. And the usage patterns of the majority of wetlands have changed since 1980. So now, since there's this declaration of Ramsar city, there's looking into how it could be conserved, planning happening around it and building on it. But this is how it was evolving over the last 30, 40 years. So between 1989 and 2016, Colombo's built-up environment increased by 25%, which also had impacts on wetlands. And aerial photographs that were analyzed suggest that between 1959 and 2018, close to 64% of the wetlands in the Colombo metropolitan region have disappeared due to different actions of development, infrastructure, expansion. So key drivers of wetland conversions could be taken as the need for land, and also urbanization, as well as not necessarily legal, but appropriation of land around wetlands for different processes. So current wetlands loss in the metropolitan area of Colombo is taken as 1.2% per year. So to address these, we have over 50 legislations which are directly connected to land management and water management. And there are also international conventions that Sri Lanka is part of, then ecosystem, forestry related ones, and also we also have the National Wetlands Policy and Strategy, as well as the Wetland Management Strategy. Then there's also the Biodiversity Framework, or Biodiversity Strategy that's from 2016 to 2022. And then also these new actions that are very targeted towards wetlands protection. And as part of climate-related actions, we have the nationally determined contributions, which were submitted by the country in 2015, ahead of Paris Agreement being signed, which were converted or ratified into nationally determined contributions from intended nationally determined contributions. And that was the first phase of it, which had also biodiversity, forestry, water as key sectors of focus. Going forward now, we have these revised NDCs that are happening, and there's a specific NDC on wetlands conservation. Plus the reporting to the UN biodiversity also focuses on wetlands as part of Sri Lanka's focused areas. And then National Adaptation Plan has a focus on wetlands, Colombo wetlands specifically also, as part of flood resilience building. And then the Western Province Plan has a lot of actions listed on how wetlands need to be focused as well. So the stakeholder mapping that I referred to include these, I would say, the multiple actors that are involved in conserving and utilizing of wetlands. These include the government actors, the private sector, the civil society organizations, academia, that does research on the topic, feeding into evidence-based policy processes. So in the mapping process of Western Province Adaptation Plan, they have identified the government actors who would need to be involved. In addition to this, we have also the ministries and the departments like the Urban Development Authority, then also the subnational level or the provincial level and municipal level actors that need to be involved. So we're looking at a holistic and integrated process of addressing environmental, social, and economic impacts so that there would be benefits that would be reaped from addressing these issues and building resilience of the wetlands to contribute to the cities as well as the country's processes related to ecosystems as well as development. Then in terms of governance, so regarding urban expansion and wetland reclamation, the number of lead agencies has at least doubled. As I mentioned, the Biodiversity Secretariat is working on this. And there's also a lot of cassettes and circulars that are being released at the moment targeting different actions related to biodiversity conservation. So there's also the actions related to flood regulation, disaster management that also overlap with the wetlands actions. So it's a lot of actors and different stakeholders that would be part of this process, and a detailed mapping would be included in the research that is being published. So looking at interconnections and linkages. So as I mentioned, there's the ecosystem biodiversity aspect of it, there's the economic aspect of it, social and economic aspect, as well as sustainable development. So the sustainable utilization of resources in a way that's not hindering the sustainable development is something that needs to be looked at. Human or health and the well-being, disaster and climate resilience, and then also looking at livelihoods, urban agriculture, the need for lands, how that's managed in a sustainable way. Looking at sustainable development goals, there's also the indicators, the national indicators that are being developed, the localizing of the process, which has a focus on different ecosystems. So SDG 1, 2, 5, 6, 13, and 15 would be very important in the process as well. And there's also nationalizing process that's happening at the moment in the sense of contextualizing the SDG indicators and looking at how these could be applied at country level. Looking at the conclusions based on the study of these aspects. So one would be that colonial era policies and land use patterns continue to influence the decisions being made and the processes related to urban wetlands and environment. The utilization of these resources in the colonial era and the policy and the guidance and the laws that have been there have a strong impact of Sri Lanka's legal system and the existing setup as well, due to the challenges that have been faced in erasing these impacts, as well as the structural setups that are there. And there's also this association of wetlands with low income or slums within course, because it's a term that has been used, and the identification of the slums as a problem area, which is persistent to some extent from the colonial era, and still which carries forward the influence and the discourse of urban management and planning today, whether the existing informal habitants or the non-land owned or the land rights not being owned by these parties living in the area, how these can be addressed would be something that needs to be focused on. And then currently wetlands provide a lot of direct benefits to low-income communities, which focus on livelihoods and different food aspects as well. And then also the flood control and regulatory services that relate to different aspects of disaster management. So how can these be addressed in a holistic and participatory and inclusive process that connects in addressing equity in the social setup is also important. However, so looking at wetlands, they are also seen as a commodity, so the use of it is seen as something important, and the potential for real estate and the land reclamation related actions. So how, again, coming back to the equity aspect of poor communities losing access to the wetlands, the resource access, their livelihoods. So this is something we need to look at in the sustainable development processes, as well as the planning processes that focus on habitat conservation and wetlands protection. And then as an entry point, we can look at the climate change and sustainable development goals. Climate change actions, NDCs, would be a building block to address some of these, as well as the localizing of SDGs and how these could take into account the aspects that relate to equity, leaving no one behind, and addressing these vulnerabilities that exist. And one of the other key recommendations would be that stakeholder consultations include enhancing institutional coordination as a key component, because there's a lot of agencies and entities working on this. And having a policy coherence, because there's over 50 legislations that are already there. And looking at how different actors, including the communities in the area, could be brought in to identify interventions and take action that could address participatory development in the city. And data availability is something that has been marked as a need, which needs to be focused on, as well as how holistic planning could happen interlinked to projects. And one more thing that is, whether it is climate finance, is development finance, how that could be addressing the needs that would have a different interconnection with the colonial setup, and how it goes into the futuristic aspects of developing country perspectives of addressing climate and development needs. But I think that's a different conversation. So I would stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Wasita. Could I now invite Dr. Mizna Muhammad and Mr. Muhammad Inas to present their paper? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just share the screen first, and then we can start off. All right. Mizna, can you start off?
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Malé city, which is the capital of Maldives, and how the landscape or the islandscape of the city has changed over time, and what it means in terms of climate change for Malé and the Maldives. So, next slide. So first, I'm just going to, we have put together just to show where we are located. So that's India. That red, I'm sorry, the square rectangle is Maldives, and we've zoomed out to show a close-up of the Maldives. So in lengthwise, it's about 820 kilometers and about 130 kilometers wide. And so these are atolls. Our country is based off atolls, and in the next slide we have zoomed into one of the atolls. This is where Malé is located. The around the atoll is where the reef islands form, and if we zoom closer, in the square is where Malé is located in the south corner of the atoll, and the zoomed in picture shows Malé. Yeah. So that's how Malé looks like now. As you can see, it's very densely populated. No trees, just lots has been So the population has increased so much, we had to expand to, on the left side, there is a small island, which is now part of Malaya satellite island, and the top corner next to the airport is another island, which was reclaimed, that used to be a lagoon, and it accommodates the increasing population. So the whole region now is known as Greater Malay. And we are looking at Malay. We were trying to see how Malay looked like originally, and one of the earliest descriptions is by Young and Christopher around the 1830s. Most of the information we have about Malay or Maldives is usually from foreigners who has traveled to the Maldives, and from their description, and most of these are very descriptive, not in numbers or quantifications, but from the descriptions, you can see Malay is small, but I think compared to other countries, Malay is a very small island. But in the description by Young and Christopher, they describe Malay as one of the most prominent islands. And describing this is when they describe Malay as looking like any other island when on approach, but when you're closer to Malay, there are boats in the harbor. Now, the importance or significance of boats is in Maldives traditionally was a fishing community, so we used fishing vessels to go and fish, and the more boats there are, that means the more fishing activity. And as one of the main economic hubs of the country, even back then, people would travel to Malay, and so there would be boats from other islands as well. So that was one of the differences they noted about Malay and the other islands, the boats in the harbor. And these other descriptions about huts and fruit trees, coconut trees. Now in Maldives, if you visit a typical island, there will be lots of coconut trees. That's the most abundant vegetation in our islands. But like if in Malay, where currently it's very rare to see a coconut tree, we have some which are planted in the parks that have been recently created in those spaces where some we're trying to put back some greenery into the islandscape. So there are some coconut trees, very few, we probably can count them easily in compared to in the islands where you see a whole area pitch filled with coconut trees. So this description about the vegetation is very significant, since you saw the map in the earlier slide, it's almost snow vegetation. And even then they describe the island is surrounded by a coral wall about 150 yards from the beach. So this we expect it's similar to the sea walls we have now, but probably the function back then would have been protection from invaders. And in the next slides, Inas is going to show an old map where these walls are. And yeah, Inas, you can carry on.
Yes, I can describe this map. This is a 1912 map. Which is rather old for a map for Maldives, because we did not have mapping capability for until very recent past. This one, I'll just zoom in.
This is the oldest available, right?
That's
map.
right. This is the oldest available, and this is from 1912. And as you can see, it's already planned to be a crowded place. But what you will also notice are that there are walls already that are in place. Here's a wall over here, and similar structures going around Malay over here, and then here as well. But on the southern end, there aren't walls built. That's partly because this central part over here was the palace where the king lived, and most of the business administration went on. We had later on businesses who came in from India and other places, and they settled in this area, which was used as mostly trade and exchange, which is why the area out there, the lagoon area, became important, because that's where the boats would come from outside of Maldives as well as from within Maldives for distribution. So that became the center of commercial activities. But you will also see these tiny dots over here, which are sort of forts that were put in place by the former protectors, to put it mildly. We had Portuguese who ruled Maldives, and Malé was their center, and they had also built some structures to oversee Malé. And this wall was also sort of a boundary for public interaction. People would not leave out of the wall because then you would be answerable to the authorities, which is the king. I have stories from my father, for example, who would go out fishing, somewhere over here in the lagoon, but the fish they catch would need to be divided, because there would be someone who would come from the palace asking for part of their commission. So you would have to give some to the palace and take it home. So that's how the entire outline of Malé was at that time.
There's a fort in front of the palace as well, right? And
that's right, over here. Yeah, which now is where the main jetty for Malé is. So I'll just show you a picture of
the former presidential jetty.
Yes.
It's not accessible to locals, just for the important government people.
So this is a picture from Google Earth, which is just a few weeks old. You can see, the lines I drew earlier. That's where the old, actual, original Malé was. What you would see is, on the eastern side, there hasn't been much changes, but we have reclaimed. I don't call it reclaimed. We have filled up the reef area to create space for living. And what we have from olden write-ups, for example, from H.C.P. Bell, who wrote extensively about Maldives, said that around in 1920s, 1921, there were about 6,127. I don't know how he counted it, but 6,127 people.
6,125. So about 6,000.
Yeah, let's call it 6,000 people on Malé, which is very, very small compared to what it is now. It's almost 35-fold. Yeah, so it's grown immensely. Mizu will highlight, Dr. Mizna would highlight it later on in her slides. But just to show the massive expansion of population and the conditions that that it has imposed on the island physically. As Mizna mentioned, there is hardly any tree left in Malé. What the greenery you see on this image are mostly planted greenery. But if you look at the central area where the palace used to be, that has still original vegetation from those days left, a few of those, because it is a park, and it has remained a park for as long as I can remember, and as long as it has been. So only those very few conserved spots have original vegetation left. There are no original beaches left, as you would imagine, with all this extensive reclamation. So what has also remained constant, though, is this area here. This is where still most of the trade happens, including international trade. That is the port. This is the international port where most of the cargo from across the globe comes to Maldives. We have 3 ports, and this is the main port where most of it comes in. So it's an extremely busy port, and you can imagine why Comoros is drawn to Male because of this port as well. What you see over here in this area are mostly fishing vessels and trade vessels between the atolls. So that area has maintained its core function of distribution and collection of goods. So I'll just go to the next slide.
This is add on something, Minister?
Sure.
I think just this original island, the shoreline, when in the works of HCP Bell, he actually forecasted that because of the being so overpopulated, we would have to use up the graveyards and those land allocated for that to for housing, and that actually happened in the 1970s. We used up those land and turned that into housing, and what he didn't predict was we would need more land, and then we would reclaim. And as Ina said, I don't like the word reclaim because we are not claiming it back, we are just making more land. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, so these are a couple of pictures just to show what it was in those days.
Is that the fort?
Yes, that's one of those small dots that I drew a circle around. So that's one of those. And what you see on the other side with the gentleman standing there was some of the business centers at that time, 1958 economic zone. I put it rough translation of the text there. The text that you see below there is the Maldivian script, which only Maldivians use. So.
And these areas were later built in more sturdy, like 2-story houses made out of coral. And now we have how many stories of the MMA building area, right? This is.
Yes, we have about 10-story buildings there now. So moving on. This one is putting together, the historical shorelines of Male. It was done by another consultancy group. The black line you see
more
is that
professionally than your drawing doodling.
Yes, slightly better than my doodling. So this is the black line shows the 1912 shoreline. And the blue line shows the current shoreline with the additional black line that is outside of it as well. So it has grown immensely. Some calculations show that it is now 50% reclaimed area, we call it, and the original Male is just 50% of what it is now. So there's a whole lot of vulnerabilities that it brings with, but that will come as we go along the presentation. Now, this is just to show the other pressures that were coming in addition to the physical pressures. The gray one shows the population of entire Maldives, how it grew from 1960 to 2019, based on World Bank data. We didn't have that far back data for Male, but from 1994, we have data for Male, and if you see how the population has been growing, it's hugging very closely to how Maldives population has been growing. But what you see at the extreme right over here is that a large portion of the population of the entire Maldives is living on Male. This is a huge pressure because there are lots of policies that drove this, but that's also the commerce that drove this. The fact that there was a harbor from long ago shows that it was a central point for goods, and it was a distribution spot. Just to elaborate that last point, This is a population growth by locality, by which I mean by Malé and the other islands. The red line is, Malé, and the gray line is the other atolls, and blue line, of course, is the entire republic. What you see is Malé has exponential growth in terms of growth rate during 2006. And then the atolls, it's exponential down. So it's very clear that, it's people migrating from the atolls into Malé for all reasons, be it commerce, be it education, health, all of those reasons. We are not talking about huge numbers here, mind you, but just that Maldives is very distributed, and the capital of Malé is very tiny. The circumference is roughly 5.5 kilometers, and that's tiny. At the moment, we have roughly 215,000 people living on it, which is probably the most dense city in the world. And that creates its own problems of public health, its own problems of resource access, and its own problems of other social issues. But it also poses huge problems environmentally, which Mizna will later connect up with climate change, access to fresh water, access to hygiene, dealing with impacts of flooding, for example. So these will come in as we go along. Over to Ms. now.
When we talk about climate change in Maldives, it's not normally, we are not talking about emissions or causing relatively visible pollution or things like that. We have our own level of pollution, like Malé. This is a picture of Malé. For example, compared to how when we were very little, when we go out in the roads in Malé, for us that pollution is visible, but it's not so much as compared to many other larger countries. But so our story about relating to climate change is more about vulnerability, and our vulnerability comes from us being a very low-lying country with the elevation. This is approximately for Malé. The elevation is around 0.85 to 1.5 meters, and this on the northern side of this picture is where our elevation is higher, but on the southern side where the boats are, the harbor is, that's one of the very low-lying areas of Malé. So with the small size of the island and the low elevation, we are very vulnerable to climate change and associated sea level rise. And just for comparison, I have put a more typical island in the Maldives. So this is how Malé would have looked like when Young and Christopher described Malé, about how it looks like any other island from when you are approaching. This is how it would have looked like. And you can see the sea level, and it's our elevation is very close to the sea level. We don't have any mountains or anything in the Maldives. And most of the islands, about 80% of the islands actually are less than 1 meter above sea level. So the next slide. So this is a map of Malé. So this is that the blue area is the one in the picture we showed, where the harbor area and the low elevation is. So this is from a study done in 2000 when we did the first national communication of the Maldives to the Climate Change Convention. And this picture shows on the top right, the red and oranges, those are the higher elevation. And the outline which Ina shows on the map, the black outline is the original Malé. And according to this study, 45% more land has been reclaimed, and which would be even more now. About 20 years later, we have added more industrial areas and more beach area from the western and eastern sides as well. So it would be more than 50% now. Next slide. And with that low-lying elevation, flooding is the most, the impact that we are most vulnerable to. While there are several causes of flooding in the Maldives Islands, focusing on Male, flooding due to heavy rainfall is the most prominent, the most problematic for Male. And climate change predictions show that island regions will experience the greatest risks of flooding. And especially for Maldives, the climate change predictions and scenarios show that flooding, extreme events, storms and surges will become heavy rainfall, will be more frequent in the future. So this is something that is very problematic for Maldives as well as Male. So this is after the motorbikes in the roads of Male. Everyone rides motorbikes, and you can see the rain. And the picture on the right with the policeman directing the traffic during the heavy rainfall is a picture taken from the blue area on the map. You can see the blue area is where the elevation is lowest in Male. So this is my work office is just further down this road. So I have in the last 10 years while I go to work experienced more frequent rain events and flooding. And in fact, we should all, I've been thinking of buying more gumboots and keeping one at work. So it's very a problem for when it floods, you get severe flooding in these areas. And not just from personal experience, also, as I've said, it's becoming more frequent compared to 20 years back, even when I worked in the same area. Next slide. And this is a 2007 study, which was a disaster risk assessment for Maldives. And the picture shows, I mentioned there are other types of other causes of flooding, which is Uda swells and storm surges. Uda is a local term for a type of a surge. As you can see, Uda is here, and this is the frequency scale. And on the vertical scale is the severity scale. So Uda is a more frequent phenomenon in the islands of Maldives, but the severity is less compared to a storm surge, which is, you can see on the top, the upside down triangle. So that has less frequency, but has more severity, more impact. Uda, this is very common in other islands in the Maldives, but these are not a problem for Male, not because it's not happening in the region, but because Male has shore protection structures built around, which was after Male had a huge tidal wave event in 1987. So this picture is taken from that time, and this caused a lot of flooding in Male. So after that, shore protection has been built, very strong shore protection around Male, and that meant even when the 2004 tsunami came, we had some Japanese scientists who came to the Maldives, and they were showing us a model of how, because the shore protection around Male was built with Japanese assistance, and they showed us how the tsunami would have impacted with and without this shore protection. And we had a lot of damage during the tsunami, but still, according to that model, the severity would have been much more without that shore protection. Yeah, the next slide, Ines. This is on the left this is an island called Midu in the one of the southern islands. It's not Malé, but I wanted to make the point about coastal protection, the importance of coastal protection for islands. So when you can see in the left, the island, and around that island is a lighter blue colored area, which is the lagoon, and in the very edge where Inas is drawing the line, but it's the natural reef of the island is there. Now, the importance of the natural reef but I want to just add a little bit of linguistics. In Maldives, the terminology for reefs there's a lot of terminology for reefs. We just don't call it reefs. So depending on where the reef is, what's the function of the reef, there's different names. So this reef around an island is called a toshi in our language. Now, toshi is more like a shell kind of thing. You say the word toshi for eggshells, bark of trees, fruit skin. So you can get the idea of sort of this protection covering with the use of that terminology. So this is the natural reef of the island, which provides protection from the waves. And in this slide on the picture on the right, it's 2 years later, this island has been almost double in size. Reclamation, that's the word there is, although we don't like it, you have to, the terminology, I will use the word reclamation. So you can see the sand has been filled to the very edge. And if you zoom in the edge, this wall is the seawall which has been built to protect this sand from getting eroded away. And so this is what would have happened. We can't show the pictures of Malé, so we just put this of a recent island. So this is what Malé would have, the transformation of Malé would have been like this. So the original reef has been destroyed, and then we put a seawall around to protect it from the high waves. So, and ironically in Malé, with the seawall gone, we don't have any more beaches, and there has been an artificial beach. I think in the next slide, yes, you have the next slide. Yeah, this is a artificial beach, which is on the eastern side of the Malé. So people in Malé don't have a beach to go if they want to go swimming. So the circular area, it has been artificially constructed, and you can see the waves coming in from the southern side, and there's not a lot of flushing. So personally, I don't like swimming there because I'm not sure about the water exchanges that's happening, and then more protection around this structure. Next slide. And this is the seawall. Sorry.
I was going to ask if I could ask you to conclude soon, because then we can have a discussion about this.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is the shore which was built around Malé, and it's 4,000 square meter dollars per square meter. But most of the other islands will not have this same luxury, or because this was a donation of by Japanese aid. So next slide, Ines. We had some more. We will just go through. So just show the same picture, the extent of reclamation. The next slides. Now, in reclamation, we want to add on that because coral reefs are very important for our island formations, and because of climate change and coral bleaching has been a big impact of climate change. So this has impacted Maldives in the past, in 1998 and 2016, but we are adding very much with the action of climate reclamation to the already severe impacts of climate change. This picture shows reclamation and dredging, and this white area is all sand, which is sediment, which is getting covering this whole area, which means any coral reefs in that area will get suffocated by that sand. So that's the impacts we are adding. Next slide. And we wanted to mention freshwater. That's another important thing for islands. It's very thin and very low and easily impacted. In fact, Malé, even before we were talking about climate change, Malé water lens was already depleted by the overuse, and government had to install large drinking water tanks for people for use. But now we supply, all the houses are supplied with desalinated water in the Malé region. So next slide. I think that's in short what we wanted to say is that while climate change and its impacts are real and impacting Maldives, but this case study of Malé shows it's more the human impacts that's adding and causing these changes, this vulnerability. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for this rich papers that I'm stimulating, rich, and visually very interesting as well. And I'm sure we have a number of questions, a number of issues that we're grappling with, which we want to discuss. So the floor is open for questions, and following the format, if you have any questions, please do send them via the chat, and I will consolidate them. While all of you are considering and thinking through some of the discussions, perhaps I'll exercise my privilege as chair to maybe just raise three broad points which I felt arose from all the papers itself. The first, and then the speakers may feel free if you want to address these themes or not, and but I'm just going to throw them out there. The first major theme that I thought struck me from all the papers was the issue of the access or the lack of access to urban space and nature. And here I'm thinking in terms of not just a city like Malé, where there's very little access to nature, ironically, given the touristy economy. And that was very aptly presented by the beach, that image of the beach, the artificial beach that was created. But there's also a great discourse of marginalization that comes through, I think, all three papers itself. And the thing that strikes me is how urbanization, but also new forms of, if I can use the term environmentalism, and I use it in inverted commas, can exclude both urbanization and environmentalism as well. Be they through the boundaries that are constructed around certain areas, walls that are constructed, gated communities, as we started with the paper in cities in Pakistan, etc., and also the construction of private gardens itself. Now, of course, this is not something new. This is a longer history. We think about Mughal gardens in South Asia, etc., about access to certain spaces, etc. But I do think that in the discourses of environment, the way in which nature is being curated today, it's worth thinking about who is the environment for, and who is it being protected from. And here the discussion on the slum dwellers in the wetlands in Colombo itself, it's worth thinking about. And of course, in urban planning, are certain groups, gendered groups, certain socioeconomic stratas being included or thought about or not. That's just one the major theme that struck me. The second major theme that struck me was how discourses and practices of vegetal culture or environmentalism overlap with and reflect elite aspirational attitudes as well. And here consumerism is tied in with, be it buying a tree or buying a house near a wetland, etc. There's this new forms of consumerism that are tagged on to new forms of environmentalism that are arising, or be they the relationship between environmentalism and tourism itself, right? And the very idea of relationship with nature is, I think, it's worth thinking about how it's changing in today's era as well. And the last broad theme that struck me from all three papers was the issue of a link between, or should I should rephrase that into who has authority over nature in the urban context. Is it the state's role, or is it the elite who have more say in this? And in all three countries, right, something that's worth noting about is urban development has in some way or other been influenced by also the role of the military itself as well. But maybe another thing I would like to throw up is, what about social movements and civil society groups in these in all three countries itself? Are these prevalent? Are they taking up causes in specific ways? And even the discourse of civil society groups, do they reflect these three themes that I've highlighted? So those are my points that I was struck by as I listened to these papers. But the floor is open to speakers for discussion, but also questions. So please do write in your questions. Would the speakers like to address any of the issues or raise any questions for the rest of the panel?
Well, I could speak a little bit to your observation about the role of the civil society.
Yeah, please.
With regard to the ongoing sort of depredations, shall we say, of the real estate developers in urban areas. And in the context of Pakistan, the space for civil society is becoming more and more constricted. And one of the more insidious sorts of ideas that is being thrown out there is that any of these conversations around, say, environmentalism, equity, human rights, and so on, is somehow anti-national. Because you see the military mind that tends to dominate the conversations in the Pakistani context, or I suppose you could say the same about increasingly the swing towards the right-wing populism, which we are seeing across the globe, not just in Pakistan. In Pakistan, it tends to take the sort of shape of the military-dominated conversations. But in many other countries, you can talk about Hindutva, you can talk about Islamism, you can talk about Donald Trump kinds of phenomena, or Boris Johnson, or sort of racially ethnicized kinds of right-wing situations. So any sort of a conversation around equity, any conversation around environmentalism, ends up being labeled anti-national. Because you're challenging the status quo. And in the context of Pakistan, pretty much all the stops around any kind of a constraint or restraint have pretty much been removed. I mean, just yesterday, there's a human rights activist who was disappeared. And in Pakistan, the military is very fond of disappearing people. I mean, they have disappeared thousands of people. And what that does is perpetuate an environment of fear and terror. You know that if you're going to speak up, you're going to be disappeared and you're going to be tortured. And who knows, there's a good chance that your body might be found with bullet-ridden or what have you. And that's what's happening. And all of it is, because you're working on someone else's agenda, that you're not nationalist enough, or you're not part of one of the boys. So it's a very unfortunate thing that the space, at least for civil society or politicized conversations around questions of environment, equity, access, are increasingly being stigmatized and almost criminalized.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I thought I could share a little bit on current status in Maldives in terms of, you had a question or statement about who does the environment belong to, and, in that line, currently we are seeing, and who is it being protected from, which is ironic again, because in our case, it's us using it and us abusing it as well. Right now, Maldives is undergoing a lot of process of devolution of powers, devolution of authorities to the islands, to the atolls, and the Decentralization Act has come in, and it's coming up with revisions on it as well, which gives additional authority to island and atoll councils to plan out their islands. And again, ironically, people are looking at how they can expand their landmass, because the example they see is of Mali, and they say Mali as the role model for development, which probably me and Misna would term as the role model of what should not be done. But there aren't any good role models of development that we can show in an island setting across the globe, actually. And that is the real setback for developing island states like Maldives to go forward, because there are models that are imported from other places which uses mostly land space for development. There aren't sea and island based setups that are there. If you look at Maldives area, the land space is less than 1% of the entire Maldives. So we really have to opt for an option where we need to find that balance. Yeah, thanks.
And is there, if I could follow up, is there any civil society? I mean, I'm sure there is, but you may. I wonder if you want to elaborate about civil society activism with regards to these issues.
Yes, before about the civil society, can I add on something a little bit?
Yes, please.
It's related to the civil society as well, in terms of how the elites or the government officials, senior people see the government. What we have been seeing is all our presidents are champions of the environment. They go out in the international arena, and they champion protecting the environment. But within it, at the same time, on a national scale, we are seeing many of the large-scale reclamation activities that are ongoing. So kind of like showing an altruism, but at the same time, at the action level, operational level, economic development is more the target. So that balance of economic and environment in sustainable development is lost. The desire for the economic development is seen more, but this altruistic phase of environment is being projected. So that's something I find it's not just one single government, but throughout is what I have been seeing. And that recently has led to a lot more civil society engagements. Maybe Nas can fill on that. So the activism, environmental activism has been created because of this very large scale. We're not talking about just developing a waste management center or storage systems for an inhabited island. I'm talking about projects of the scale of reclaiming whole areas to build airports which may not be needed. For example, in the north, there was one case where a lot of activism was generated around this airport that was being built. It destroyed a very unique mangrove ecosystem, and there's an airport 20 minutes away already, an international airport. So these kind of things, I'll let Inaz add on to.
Could you unmute, please? Yeah. Could you unmute?
Yep. All right. So I was going to say it's partly because of the rapid growth. If you can recollect from one of my slides, there was a gentleman standing next to a rough building.
Yeah.
That was 1958, and that was the capital of Maldives, and that was the capital commercial center of Maldives. Just 63 years ago, that's what we were. And now, very far ahead of that. The GDP has gone so much folds that we are counted as middle income and in the middle band of it, I think. So this rapid growth over just one single generation, I think we are not able to grapple with, the impacts of it because, first of all, the education system couldn't keep up with that rapid economic growth, and so the caring for the environment could not be built into the education setup. And because Maldives grew up so fast, people saw that as a way forward, and people did not see that the huge impact it had on the island that was bearing all this development. And I think that is that fast growth actually has this negative impact of humans not being able to fathom the impact that growth it had, simply because it took place in just over a generation. I think that's something to, I think, another research be done on, and people who had who had a lot of issues in terms of, for example, that airport being built. Even the EIA report that was done for it did not encourage a development of an airport in there, but yet somehow it came up. So Maldives is undergoing so much of change right now in terms of political development as well, that people's focus are not really on one thing at a time. There are so many variables. People want to be politically aligned at the same time, environmentally aligned, and all these things create a lot of conflict conceptually for us. And many of the civil society are also not able to grapple with that confusion that comes with it. So I think it's part of maturing that we are going through, unfortunately, costing us a lot of environmental costs.
And then I guess also we have to also address the issue of these civil society groups within a certain urban context. So their concerns may also reflect an elite aspirational issue as well. So it's worth considering that. Danish has raised a point on the chat, which I think everyone is worth us all considering. It's a broader conceptual issue, which actually I think arises quite well from where Inas ended as well. Maybe this is something we should, I'm gonna read it out to everyone, but maybe something we should consider and bring back in the end of our second panel as well, where we'll be having a general discussion, I believe, of some of the broader points that we emerged from over the 2 days. And Danish's point is that he thinks in the context of the global south, the whole discourse around environment often ends up having very regressive impacts. And perhaps it's time to dispense with the term, as it doesn't seem to do any good. And he's throwing up the question that we need, or I would say he's asserting the point that we need different politics to address this issue. So I think that's a good way to maybe end this panel, open up space for next panel. I'll come back to this point at the summation points. Is that right?
That sounds fine.
Because I think this is a broader conceptual issue that we have to grapple with. So, thank you to all the speakers. I'm sorry we lost Rosita, and I'm looking forward to the next panel as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of panel 3.